21.
Start me a card for a parking problem.
Foreigner 23.
Yes, that's where I'm gonna.
For me, policing is protection, protection, order, and serving. For some people, the police represent safety, it represents protection, it represents order, right? Which is what I said. For others, policing, on the other hand, represents fear, surveillance, and unequal treatment. Obviously, this sentiment differs among different ethnic and racial groups, but it is a very commonly shared feeling among races, among people, among genders, right? Now, of course, while it is shared, the answer ultimately differs based on personal experiences, right? Such as where someone grew up and how they understand the relationship between police and community, right? Now, over the last several years, right, few events have occurred where police have obviously brutalized people in such a way that society has outraged from it, right? Now, one death in particular, and I just briefly mentioned it right now, was George Floyd's death. Now, George Floyd's death was recorded by bystanders at the time, at the moment, at the scene, and his death ultimately circulated a lot of global attention, and it sparked one of the largest protest movements in America. Millions of Americans marched, millions of Americans rioted. Obviously, some of the riots weren't done out of good faith, but who am I to judge? I don't know anything. I mean, I don't know the gist of the riots. When I think of protest, I think of marching, right? But I'm not into breaking into businesses and stealing shoes. But anyways, millions of people marched, politicians debated police reform. Minnesota actually saw a huge policy change. And it's not just Minnesota that obviously saw the big policy changes, right, in law enforcement, but it was just all across the entire country. I mean, many different DT tactics were sorry, it's my police language. A lot of de-escalation tactics were actually implemented as a result to prevent deaths, especially on the field. Now, I'm going to examine the killing of George Floyd and how that reshaped political debates, and more importantly, I will analyze how race and racialized systems are ultimately influenced by the public response to George Floyd's death and the broader discussions that followed. Now, obviously, we're going to be looking at the historical relationship between race and policing. We're going to look into the rise of protest movements. We're going to look into the history of political conflicts that have emerged afterwards. And I argue that the debate surrounding George Floyd was never only about one individual incident, but more so it was about every incident. It's about how every incident has led up to this moment. And after this moment, we should look to find interventions, better ways to handle a simple stop over a counterfeit bill. There's no need to kneel over someone. There's no need to kill someone, right? There are better ways to de-escalate and prevent death, right? Like I said, it's a quick grab and go. Simple as that. You go, grab your suspect, arrest him, put him in the back of the car, and get out of there. Simple as that. In this video that I'm going to show right now, will be what occurred on the day that George Floyd died. So have a watch.
Judge ordering that release of 2 body camera videos from George Floyd's arrest and death.
Let me see your other hand. Please, both hands. Do nothing.
Just seconds after approaching the vehicle, rookie officer Thomas Lane pulls his gun and points it at a noticeably startled and scared Floyd.
Please.
To understand why George Floyd's death generated such a powerful reaction, it's important to revisit what happened briefly. Now, obviously, on the year of 2020, late May, George Floyd, a black man, was arrested by police officers because a store employee had reported him for using a counterfeit $20 bill, which is a pretty severe crime. Pretty severe. A lot of homeless people and poor people who are struggling, tend to suffer or fall in the category of committing this crime because, of course, counterfeit bills are sometimes hard to find, and usually when people are desperate to purchase things or eat or something, they won't really just be like, wow, this bill looks real. No, this bill looks fake. No, people don't care, They see a dollar bill, they're gonna say, that Benjamin looks beautiful and crispy, and I'm gonna buy something. So ultimately, as I researched this topic, one thing became clear about policing and about the multiple deaths of Black Americans leading up to George Floyd's death and afterwards. Now, like I mentioned, as I researched this topic, one thing became clear. George Floyd's death was not viewed as an isolated incident by many, but more so was interpreted as an identification of a larger pattern, of a larger problem as well, right? Now, for many observers, the video appears to confirm long-standing concerns about racial inequality within policing and obviously the criminal justice system. Now, this brings us to one of the more important concepts of this course, which is racialization. And I think we've even had debates and discussions about this. Now, racialization refers to the process through which racial meanings become attached to groups. In other words, stereotypes, right? So, in other words, society creates associations between race and certain characteristics, right? These associations are often influence how institutions operate, how people interpret events. For example, without trying to sound racially negative, but there is a very large stigma with white people and how they view black people. Essentially, a white person sees a black person in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, because there are stereotypes, obviously, you can already begin to see the pattern, right? Is, people are very naive. They're very easy to manipulate, right? And then especially when it comes to antagonizing another race, it's very possible. And ultimately, when discussing policing in America, right, racialization, such as the one I just mentioned, has played a significant role through history. I mean, black communities have frequently been portrayed as emphasizing criminality, danger, disorder, which is exactly what I mentioned, a very common thing which you will see a lot, especially growing up. It's not just the African Americans who experience that, it's also Hispanics, oftentimes Asians too, I mean, it's there. Now, historically, policing in the United States has often intersected with systems of racial control, and scholars have oftentimes pointed to slave patrols in the South, which has occurred, the enforcement of segregation during the Jim Crow era, and the discriminatory practices during the war on drugs, as examples of how race has ultimately influenced law enforcement. While contemporary policing differs significantly from those historical institutions, many critics argue that some inequalities continue to persist. And again, this has to do with the structural racism, the structural inequalities, the what my AP US history teacher has told me, the systemic inequalities, the systemic biases. These portrayals have not only shaped public opinion, but have also influenced policy decisions and law enforcement practices. Now, to understand the reaction to George Floyd's death, we need to recognize that many communities were already carrying historical memories of unequal treatment, right? And ultimately, the incident itself does not occur in a vacuum per se, but instead it entered an environment where debates about race and social inequality and policing had existed for generations. So what I'm getting at is that essentially George Floyd's death was not just, taken in by Americans and came out to the back end. It was more so taken by Americans, and then the Americans just thought about it. Why does this happen? Why does this brutality occur? Why do people die? And so when they look at the way that de-escalation works, when they look at the way that police treat others, and when they look at that yes, there have been many black Americans in the past 5 years that have died in similar fashions, then people begin to realize, hey, there's a deeper problem here and we gotta fix it. And excuse my language, but we're literally like, we gotta fix this fucking problem, because it's true. We do gotta fix it. Doesn't matter what it is, we have to fix it. Now, moving on. Obviously, one of the more visible responses to Floyd's death came through the BLM movement, and as we know, BLM obviously originated way before Floyd's sudden death in 2020. But BLM obviously represented Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, a couple of African Americans who have died to the hands of the police, just to name a few. What I find interesting about this event, especially, and obviously many of these events, is how differently people interpreted the events. Obviously, supporters viewed the demonstrations as a necessary response to systemic injustice. They argued that public pressure is essential. They argued that the riots were essential because the institutions failed. They failed to address racial disparities in policing. But others believe different. Others believe that demonstrations unfairly generalize the actions of officers, of like one or two officers. And people began to blame entire police departments, and others worried about the rising crime rates and questioned whether policing itself was the cause of the problem. And then you had that small minority that obviously racially said, hey, these black people that are rioting, that's what they do, that's what they're born for. And unfortunately, those movements did cause and did create a lot of racial divide again. It's like, if you were to ask me my personal opinion on it, I just think the riots were stupid. I don't see the purpose to steal from a Nike store and the shoes and then post about it on Instagram saying, oh yeah, I got new shoes at the riots. Come on, dude, like, what's the purpose of that? Is it stupid? I mean, hell yeah, but who am I to judge? Yeah, anyways, moving on. So the disagreement between many groups obviously reveals an important connection between race and politics. Now, this debate was not just about facts, but it was also about interpretation. We have to interpret why Chauvin did that, interpret why society reacted the way it did, interpret how the police department in Minneapolis reacted, how they handled the situation. Obviously, politicians debated police funding, accountability measures, qualified immunity, body cameras, use of police force, and etc. News organizations devoted extensive coverage to the topic. A lot of reporters were on this topic nonstop, 24/7, every day since George Floyd had died. And it increased actually during the riots across the entire globe, not globe, sorry, across the entire country. In many ways, the political polarization surrounding policing obviously reflected broader divisions within American society, which is what I mentioned, right? That people reacted positively, like, yeah, and others were like, you know what, these people. So, yeah. And here's more of what occurred so you can see what happened. Another course concept that ultimately helps explain these events is the idea of racialized systems. And obviously, a racialized system exists when institutions produce different outcomes across racial groups, even when explicit discrimination may not always be visible. So ultimately, this concept shifts attention away from individual prejudice and more toward broader social systems. Um, one reason this idea is obviously important is because conversations about racism often become focused on personal intentions. Now, people ask questions such as, was the officer racist? Is there bias? Did the individual, the officer, did he want to discriminate, right? Like, people try to find a motive or a reason for why this situation occurred. Now, obviously, for example, in policing and in the book Policing in America, one of the books that I actually researched by let me find the name, by Ronald Waitzer and Stephen Touch, speak about how researchers have ultimately documented disparities in traffic stops, arrests, use of force incidents, and incarceration rates. The causes of these disparities remain debated, but the existence of the unequal outcomes has contributed to that ongoing concerns about systemic inequality. So, for example, a traffic stop for a black individual may look a lot more different than a traffic stop for a white individual, is what essentially Weitzer was trying to argue here. Now, obviously, after Floyd had died, many activists argued that reform efforts should focus on institutions rather than individual officers. But I ultimately disagree because every officer will act on their own accord, obviously, especially on the field, right? They have a decision to make, and oftentimes it will either be a good decision or a bad decision. The institution itself will not control a governing body of the law, and they can't. Yes, and I mean, yeah, activists argue that. I disagree. But this perspective explains why discussions expanded beyond just Minneapolis. I mean, this is why the protests occurred in LA and other areas. Numerous police departments adopted reforms. Reforms on what, you may ask? De-escalation, approaches towards arrests, approaches towards handling individuals, towards handling just anybody, right? Some agencies expanded body camera programs. This is why now here in California, it's imperative if you are a public safety officer or if you are a law enforcement officer, an agent of safety, you must have a body camera to record any and all incidents. So some agencies expanded and revised the use of force policies or increased officer training requirements, and other states passed legislation related to police accountability and transparency. At the same time, many activists argued that these reforms did not go far enough. In other words, some of these activists wanted more than what was already, written on the legislation. Critics of the reform efforts often pointed out that basically the social problems cannot be solved through policy changes alone, but essentially they're arguing that more needs to be done to address long-standing inequalities. Meanwhile, opponents of the more extensive reforms express different concerns. And this just goes to show how overly annoying and how overly complicated the idea of policing and inequality is here in the country. It's very annoying. Others argued that the reform efforts placed unfair blame on law enforcement officers, and others worried that reducing the resources for the police would undermine public safety. So, at the end of the day, people are very divided on this because everyone's biased in their own sense. But it's like, even myself, I could be very biased, and so could the next door neighbor, so could the manager at Panda Express, so could the manager at AutoZone, so could the teacher, so could Camille, the TA. Anybody could be biased, and it's just like, that's just the reality of it. No matter who it is, I don't care if you are a by the book Bible person. At the end of the day, you will still have some bias. Whether it's towards an individual, whether it's towards a thing, whether it's towards a subject, whether it's towards an activity, you will always have a bias. There's always a bias. That's just human nature, and that's just the reality. And this is ultimately why the disagreement remains to this day. Yep, the agreement remains to this day, almost years after the event. Debates about crime, policing, race, and public safety continue. They continue to shape elections, legislative agendas, public discourse. I mean, hell, we have the elections for, I believe it's the governor for California. Chad Bianco is trying to establish a lot more safer and faster route for gun control, gun ownership, while also implementing some stricter law enforcement stuff. And that's also the reason why he's losing the elections right now, right? But we also have other, politicians all across this nation that are trying to push for gun control, law enforcement policies, etc. So at the end of the day, you kind of understand what it is. Here's another video that essentially talks about policing.
On June 19th, police in East Pittsburgh shot and killed 17-year-old Antoine Rose as he fled a car. The vehicle was stopped during the investigation of a drive-by shooting. Rose was shot 3 times in the back as he ran. The officer who fired the shots was later charged with criminal homicide. Many of these incidents have taken on hashtags and memes of their own, often referred to as living while black. We examined the concerns and some of the responses with the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson. Derek Johnson, thanks so much for being here. I want to jump right in. There have been incident after incident of people calling the police on black people while doing regular everyday things like swimming and barbecuing. What do you think is at the heart of these incidents?
Well, we've seen since the president election in 2016 an increase of intolerance. You have individuals who simply see young kids and think they are criminals. They pose a danger. In my home city of Detroit, Michigan, a 14-year-old simply asking for direction to schools to get shot at. The level of intolerance is germinating directly from the White House.
Discipline and Punished by Michel Foucault, a very famous anthropologist and criminologist as well. He's a bit of both. He argues that punishment changes form, and when he says this, he's talking about prisons, right? So when an individual gets arrested and sent to prison, obviously the prison follows kind of like a guideline, like program, kind of like a school, where they seek to shape behavior, habits, and identity. Now, obviously, like I mentioned, other institutions do the same. The military, a school, a psychiatry ward, they do the same. And every one of these institutions follow the same program. So it's actually interesting to really see that. Now, moving on, obviously, right? Seeing from all this, it shows that conversations about policing cannot be separated from conversations about race. Why I say this is because at the end of the day, every race will be impacted by policing, no matter what it is, no matter how you look like. You will be treated a certain way based on the way you present yourself. It's as simple as that. Now, obviously, like I mentioned, for some communities, interactions with law enforcement are shaped by generations of experience. So, for example, South Central LA takes LAPD as a joke. The sheriffs as a joke. A lot of people in this area of LA take LAPD and sheriffs as like, you know what, these guys are dog. And that's just the reality of it, But why, right? Why? Is it because, and when you think about it, it's like, the reason why they think that's because LAPD or the sheriffs take a long time to get to the, to the crime. Take a long time to get to this place, to come help, right? But then when it comes to a simple minor offense, they respond. Like 5 officers come just for a transient. Like why? What's the point? Now, obviously, for others, policing may be understood primarily through concerns about crime prevention and public safety, and both perspectives influence political debates and both contribute to the complexity of the issue. Anthropologists remind us that institutions do not exist independent from culture, but people assign meaning to the institutions through shared beliefs, through experiences, through narratives, right? And obviously, this is what had occurred during George Floyd's entire death and the situation and all of 2020 with the riots and stuff. So, to get this point further across, different groups interpreted the same event through different cultural and political lenses or issues or mindsets or mentalities. Everyone saw this differently. Hispanics, African Americans, etc. All of these interpretations influenced how people understood accountability, responsibility, justice, and reform. How did the killing of George Floyd reshape political debates about policing, and what does the public response reveal about race and racialized systems in the US? The answer is ultimately this. George Floyd's death became a catalyst for a much larger conversation. It forced Americans to confront the realities of systemic racism, state authority, accountability, and public safety. It highlighted the role that race continues to play within political life and within, everyday ongoing life, public safety, etc. Furthermore, it demonstrated how historical inequalities can shape contemporary events, such as how George Floyd's death had influenced, law enforcement agencies and other modes of public safety. And whether one person views the incident as evidence of systemic failure or individual misconduct or a combination of both, there is little doubt that George Floyd's death did indeed transform public discussions about policing. And it did. Not just the discussions, but it changed policing as a whole, Years later, obviously, as we know, the debates continue. People still argue about it. People still talk about George Floyd. And there are still countless people dying. And the police are either not doing their due diligence and taking accountability, and there are still lawsuits. There are a lot of things still ongoing, right? Now, the questions raised in 2020 have not disappeared. Like I already said, it's still ongoing. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.
Let's talk about George Floyd. You said George Floyd's death was a terrible thing.
Terrible.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way. More white people.